Welcome to our 16th annual Dudley Allen Sargent Lecture, Head Games, Chronic Traumatic Encephalopathy and the Long-Term Consequences of Repetitive Brain Trauma. Do you remember where you were last January 18th? Because I do. Instead of spending a fascinating hour or so with Dr. Stern and all of you, as we'd carefully planned for several months, I was hunkered down for the first of many of 2015's storms of the century, which we learned to call the storm of the week. So thanks to a lot of grace, patience, persistence, and good luck, we're here now, postponed, but still excited and ready to learn. So anticipation and expectations are high. In fact, the last time most of us waited this long for something, there was a baby at the end.
Hopefully it won't be as painful.
I'm sure you're about to find that the wait has been worth it. Last winter is ancient history, and the leaves are just starting to blush, nary a snowflake in sight, and we're ready to go. First, a word about this lecture series. The Dudley Allen Sargent Distinguished Lecture Series began in 1999 when the college celebrated its 70-year history with Boston University. In honor of our founder, Dudley Allen Sargent, these lectures offer Boston University, Sargent College, and the Boston area communities the opportunity to interact with leading researchers and practitioners in the health and rehabilitation fields. Dr. Sargent was an innovator in physical conditioning. He was decades ahead of his time. In establishing the Sargent School of Physical Training in 1881, he sought to improve the health of individuals and the nation. His mission, which is amazingly consistent with our mission 135 years later, was to provide students with comprehensive healthcare training and to, quote, fortify well people, to strengthen the weak, and to restore the disabled to more normal function, end quote. During the decades that followed, Dr. Sargent built his reputation as a pioneer in the integration of physical training with scientific principles, and he was a leader in the field of preventative medicine. Dr. Sargent also helped to establish the American Association for the Advancement of Physical Education and the Boston Health Education League. We at Sargent College are honored to bear and sustain the legacy of this pioneering physician. It's my great honor and privilege today to introduce our Dudley Allen Sargent speaker, Dr. Robert Stern. Dr. Stern is professor of neurology, neurosurgery, and anatomy and neurobiology at Boston University School of Medicine, where he serves as director of the clinical core for the Alzheimer's Disease Center and director of clinical research for the Chronic Traumatic Encephalopathy Center. A major focus of Dr. Stern's research involves the long-term effects of repetitive brain trauma in athletes and the military, including the neurodegenerative disease, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. He's received funding from the National Institutes of Health and the Department of Defense for his work on developing methods of detecting and diagnosing CTE during life, as well as examining potential genetic and other risk factors for the disease. His other major areas of funded research include the assessment and treatment of Alzheimer's disease, the cognitive effects of chemotherapy in the elderly, thyroid-brain relationships, as well as driving and dementia. Dr. Stern has published more than 250 journal articles, chapters, and abstracts, including work on various aspects of cognitive assessment. He's the senior author of many widely used neuropsychological tests, including the Neuropsychological Assessment Battery, and is a fellow of both the American Neuropsychiatric Association and the National Academy of Neuropsychology. He serves on a number of editorial boards as well as the medical and scientific advisory boards of the Massachusetts, New Hampshire chapter of the Alzheimer's Association and Sports Legacy Institute, and is a member of the Mackey-White Traumatic Brain Injury Committee of the NFL Players Association. Dr. Stern frequently appears in national and international print and broadcast media for his work on CTE and Alzheimer's disease, and has testified before the U.S. Senate Special Committee on Aging. He also appears in the feature-length documentaries League of Denial, which aired in PBS's Frontline in 2013, Head Games, which was produced in 2012, and I Remember Better When I Paint, produced in 2009. One quick word before welcoming Dr. Stern to the podium. There will be a reception immediately following his lecture, one floor up in our Setterberg Lounge. I hope you'll all join us. Now please join me in welcoming our 16th annual Dudley Allen Sargent lecturer, Dr. Robert Stern. Thanks so much.
Wow, I made all that up. This is a really cool thing to do. You know, I get to speak all over the place, and it's only when I get to speak here in Boston that I get nervous, because I know people. I have wonderful colleagues here, I have friends here, I have family members here, and I'm not used to that. So I'm leaving. It really is an honor to be here, even after this very long gestation. I just hope I don't hear any screams of childbirth in the audience during my lecture. I am truly honored to be the Dudley Allen Sargent speaker because of this incredible history and what this whole college represents. And so thank you so very much. I want to start off with some disclosures. These are places that give me some money, and so I need to just make sure you're all aware of those things so I don't have any overt conflict of interest. But I also need to make one very important additional disclosure. I am a football fan. It's going to be hard for you to understand that statement in a little bit. It's hard for me to reconcile that on a daily basis, and you'll figure out why. The Patriots won this game. Remember that? This is the Super Bowl. This was like the world's best experience in life. And then you're going to say in a few minutes, how the hell can he do that? We don't give a Yeah, so what's a concussion? I'm going to give you one definition, and this is one out of around 150 published definitions of concussion. There really are that many. A concussion occurs from forces applied to, directly or indirectly, to the skull or the body that result in the rapid acceleration and deceleration of the brain. And that sudden change in cerebral velocity elicits what's called neuronal shearing. The long axons connecting the nerve cells shear, they get stretched and sheared, and all that produces changes in ionic balance and metabolism. When you have all that happen, and it's accompanied by clinical signs and symptoms, those changes in the cellular functioning are what we refer to as a mild traumatic brain injury or concussion. All right, I'll translate it. You get hit. Your head, your body, your brain moves around like this. It results in these immediate changes to your cells. What happens in the cells is the good stuff inside the cells sneak out, the bad stuff comes in, and that's all happening at a time when those brain cells need increased energy but are getting less blood flow to them because of the injury. And those changes lead to the functioning of the brain cells, resulting in the symptoms and signs that we call concussion, that I'll explain in a second. It does not require a loss of consciousness. In fact, less than 10% of concussions result in a loss of consciousness. It is not a bruise to the brain, contrary to what a lot of people describe. It is a brain injury. It is definitely a brain injury. People think of it as, oh, it's just something temporary, so it's not an injury. And so what's going on? Concussion is the result of this thing happening. You have to think about the brain being the consistency of Jell-O mold. And that Jell-O mold's surrounded by fluid, and then surrounded by that rock-like skull. And when you get hit, either like this, a linear hit, a lateral hit, or one of the worst types of rotational hit, that jello mold moves around and the stuff inside stretches and shears and results in those cellular changes that I just described. And then there's the symptoms. Symptoms can be broken into things referred to as the physical parts of it, such as headache, poor balance, blurry vision, nausea, light and noise sensitivity. There can be thinking problems, cognitive changes, such as feeling in a fog, memory problems, poor concentration, slowing of reaction time, and just a general slowing of thought. And then because of this brain injury, there can also be changes in mood and behavior, depression, irritability, impulsivity, anxiety, and then also changes in sleep, either excess fatigue, too much sleep, too little sleep. And all of that requires a lot of rest. Not just physical rest, but also cognitive rest in order to allow those cells to pump the good stuff back in and the bad stuff out so they can start working well again. And thank goodness, over the last several years, there have been unbelievable strides in sports concussion awareness and management. I didn't know there was going to be this one guy here in the audience today, or I would have shown a picture, I would have planned what I was going to say. But there's one person probably more responsible for the awareness that's gone on in concussion, sports concussion policy, rules, and the management of these things than anyone else in the entire world. And I say that whether he's in the audience or not. And that guy's named Chris Nowinski. And Chris is the big guy in the front row. I recommend that you either read his book called Head Games or watch the movie that you can get on demand and Netflix and all that kind of stuff to learn about Chris's story. But there's one single person in the world who's made the biggest impact, and it's he. And where is it him? Is it he? Whatever. So those changes have done this. Look at this. We now know how to detect and manage a concussion. Or perhaps in college baseball, you have the more difficult types of assessment on the field. This is a great way to figure out if someone's had a concussion. I'll let you all read it, then the laughter will start to buzz. All right, one more important disclosure. It's a pretty big one. I actually know very little about concussions. It's not my area of expertise. The real experts are right here at Sargent College, in the Ryan Center at BU, the people who actually deal with concussions, and the scientists who understand these things. I don't do this. It's not my area of expertise. I'm a neurodegenerative disease researcher and clinician. So that's all I'm going to talk about for concussion. Here's another disclosure. I'm actually not very concerned about concussions when it comes to this brain disease that happens later in life. And why is that? Because concussions actually may be just the tip of the iceberg. What I mean by that is that there's this whole thing that we refer to as repetitive head impacts. And on the very tippy top of that iceberg are the major traumatic brain injuries, the ones with loss of consciousness and coma and residual problems. And then the ones we talk about all the time, the things that we hear about every week on the TV and at water coolers, those are the symptomatic mild traumatic brain injuries, these concussions. But then you have everything under the water, what we refer to as subconcussive trauma. Things that happen, maybe in sports like this, or perhaps at the line in football, can happen a lot in various sports, various activities. And what it is an impact to the brain with adequate G-force, adequate force to have an effect on the neuronal functioning. Perhaps that same type of thing I was just referring to before, but not to the degree where there's the symptoms and the signs of concussion, and so it's not detected, it's not complained about. But they happen a lot. And some sports and some positions in sports are indeed very prone to these types of hits. So for example, a football lineman, imagine every play of every game and every practice. They go like this. Perhaps 1,000 to 1,500 of these hits per season. Each one at around 20 to 30 G of force. For kids or high school students or college students who play both sides of the line, double those numbers. Soccer heading, the typical header, perhaps from a midfielder, is around 15 G. And that happens around 1,000 times per season. All right, go back to your physics class. Remember what G is. G, force, is mass times acceleration. There's one thing that people talk about all the time, and it's indeed true. The numbers are there. There's research to show it that indeed our athletes are getting bigger and faster. Mass times acceleration.
Wilford's running. What did you think of the big man?
Well, and listen, it's impressive. The hands. Vince Wilford,
I
probably
still
in high
mourn
school, early in
the
his
loss
career, was probably a running back. I'm serious.
Will Fork from our beloved Patriots, but he's 325 pounds. And he can run faster than anyone here. And imagine two 300-pounders with that speed hitting themselves 1,000, 1,500 times a year. Can't be good for you. So what do we know about this? Well, here's just one example of how often this happens just in high school football players. Steve Brolio and colleagues put accelerometers, these little sensor gizmos inside helmets, to measure the force in high school football players. And he looked at it over a season. And on average on this team, there were 652 hits over 15 G of force in one season. One kid had over 2,000 of these in one season. And now there's a growing, really good research that shows that even after one season of hits in football, in college, and various types of activities, without any concussions, there can be changes in cognitive functioning, physiological functioning of the brain, and actual structural changes as depicted on MRI scans. So the big question is, do concussions and subconcussive trauma lead to what I'm going to refer to now as neurodegeneration, the progressive loss of brain tissue, a disease that destroys and robs the brain of its function? So that's an interesting course. The goal is to induce brain trauma, brain injury. Anyone know who the guy on the right is? What's his name? What's his name? Who just said it? Who said Cassius Clay? Who? It was over there. Oh, give her free tuition. It was a trick question. That was before he changed his name from Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali. So, now you picture this person who can't get the words out right, who's kind of blah, can't think on his feet. No, that's Bush. Yeah, I once told that joke in Texas. That wasn't good. So we have known about the long-term consequences of repetitive head impacts in boxing for quite a long time. In fact, there was a paper in the Journal of the American Medical Association, the journal, back in 1928 by a pathologist named Martland. And the name of the paper was called Punch Drunk, in which he described the long-term consequences of hitting your head over and over again in boxing. Used such wonderful scientific terms in JAMA as slug nutty, goofy, and then he goes on to say that after a long time, they require institutionalization in an asylum because of dementia. A few years later, the term traumatic encephalopathy was used, and then dementia pugilistica is one that I think a lot of people are familiar with. The dementia of pugilists, the boxers. And then it was actually 1940 for the first time that the term chronic traumatic encephalopathy was used in the literature, because it is more general. We're not talking about just boxers. Because in fact, American football might actually have some problems with this as well. Back in 1933, there was a paper in the Homeopathic Medical Society of Pennsylvania where it was the first case of being punch-drunk dementia in football players, including one guy who, quote, forged checks and did things suggesting the behavior of psychopathic personality and the condition we sometimes find in pugilists and boxers, pummeled about the head. 1933, about American football. 1937, a former Columbia University football player was getting concerned about what's going on with his teammates, so he made it his mission to go out and find all of his Columbia teammates a little later in life, but not too much later. And he got a hold of them, and he uncovered these things that he described as dementia, vagrancy, and motor deficiencies in 7 of his classmates, 7 out of 1 class at Columbia who played football. And then there was this period between the 1980s and the 2000s, I refer to as the cover-up period. You might want to see that documentary called League of Denial, or read the book called League of Denial. It was brought to you by the Mild Traumatic Brain Injury Committee of the NFL. There's this guy named Ira Casson who was a replacement for an even worse chair of that committee for the NFL. And I just want to play this for you. If I could make sure the volume's going to be up on this one.
Before I get to my questioning, I want to first show a brief clip that is courtesy of HBO's Real Sports.
Ira Casson leads a team of NFL doctors who did a study of several hundred active players and reported that the concern over head injuries is overblown.
Is there any evidence, as far as you're concerned, that links multiple head injuries among pro football players with depression? No. With dementia? No. With early onset of Alzheimer's? No. Is there any evidence as of today that links multiple head injuries with any long-term problem like that? In NFL players? Yeah. No.
Okay, and Mr.
Call him Dr. No. All right, so what really brought it to light was in the year 2002, a former Pittsburgh Steeler superstar named Mike Webster tragically died at a young age, and his brain was autopsied by a pathologist named Bennett Omalu. And he discovered in his brain that this football player had chronic traumatic encephalopathy. He then wrote it up and it was published in 2005, and that started this whole kind of increased media attention to CTE, to this disease that had been known for decades and decades. It wasn't until a famous American football player was discovered to have it that people actually paid attention. Perhaps even too much attention. That is now going to be made into a feature-length film starring Will Smith as Dr. Bennett Omalu called Concussion, which is a misnomer in and of itself, because we're not talking about concussion, remember. And it's coming out on Christmas Day. So what are we talking about here? This disease I'm referring to as chronic traumatic encephalopathy is the same thing as dementia pugilistica. What is it? It's a neurodegenerative disease that's similar to Alzheimer's disease, but it's a unique disease, both neuropathologically and clinically. And it's believed to be caused, at least in part, by a history of being exposed to repetitive hits to the head, including concussions, and now we know subconcussive trauma as well. And that repetitive trauma appears to start in motion a cascade of events that eventually leads to this progressive neurodegeneration. It's not prolonged post-concussion syndrome. It's not like you have a big hit and you're impaired and it sticks around for a while. It's not the cumulative effects of injuries. It's not like you get one injury and then you get another and it gets worse and worse. The disease appears to begin early in life at the time of getting hit. But then it's not until years or decades later that the symptoms actually start. And then they continue to worsen. But here's the rub. Like Alzheimer's disease and other neurodegenerative diseases, even in the year 2015, CTE can currently only be diagnosed for sure after someone dies. My colleague, Dr. Ann McKee, here at BU, has seen more cases of brains with CTE than anyone in the world. She has developed, along with what's now referred to as the Concussion Legacy Foundation, was called Sports Legacy Institute, the program that Chris Nowinski created and now heads, along with my colleague Dr. Robert Cantu. This brain bank that it's not like you go in and you make a deposit and a withdrawal. It's not that kind of brain bank. It's a place where brain tissue is stored and examined. And so far there's been well over 250 brains examined of people with a history of repetitive hits. Back in 2013, Anne published this paper in a very prestigious journal called Brain. That was really, at the time, the largest series of cases of people who died and whose brains were examined after histories of repetitive brain trauma. To know what I'm going to be talking about now, I just want to stop for a second and talk about this protein called tau. And tau, also the longer name is microtubule-associated protein tau, is something that we all have in every nerve cell in our brain. And what it does is, this is the long axon that connects one brain cell to another. So here's the cell body, and here's an axon. And what keeps those axons nice and kind of stiff and not flimsy and carries the information from one cell to another is the microtubule. And what makes those microtubules intact is this protein called tau, these little purple things. I don't think they're really purple, but in this picture, these little purple things are these proteins that keep the tubules intact and allows the healthy neuron to function appropriately. But for some reason, in some conditions, this protein becomes misfolded and then takes on extra phosphorates, becomes hyperphosphorylated. And it then destroys the integrity of the protein. It falls off of this microtubule. The protein itself starts clumping together to create what are called neurofibrillary tangles. And eventually, because all this stuff is happening, the brain cell dies. First, it can't function well because it's not making the right connections between the cells. And then because of this really kind of self-destruction process, the cells die. So that's your little background of this thing called tau. Why am I bringing it up? Because that is the essence of CTE, that the neuropathology of this disease is characterized by an abundance of this abnormal form of this protein. And mostly it's in the way of these things called neurofibrillary tangles. And the pathognomonic finding, meaning the one set of findings that makes CTE different from any other disease, even diseases like Alzheimer's disease that also have this abnormal tau. It's a different thing, though, and those specific differences are where the tau initially starts to aggregate and clump together. And those two ways that we describe it is that early in the disease, the tau has this perivascular distribution around the blood vessels. And at the depths of the cortical sulci, a sulcus is the like ribbon of the brain. If you think about the outside of the brain, the little valleys are the sulci. Later on, though, after this initial kind of clumping around the blood vessels at the depths of the sulci, it starts to spread and takes over the entire brain. And probably the method by which it spreads is something called prion spread that we're finding out in most of these neurodegenerative diseases. These proteins get from one part of the brain to the other and then continues to kind of take over. This is a picture from Dr. McKee's work with a special stain that turns brown when it attaches to this abnormal tau protein. And so this is under a microscope. This white part in the middle is a small blood vessel. And you can see all this brown tau stuff clumping around the blood vessel. This right here is that kind of valley of the cortex. And here you can see this incredible deposition of the tau at that depth of the cortical sulcus. And what seems to happen is that it does start in those little teeny pockets in the depths of the sulci early on. But then it seems to get worse and spread, and through additional years it gets even worse, and eventually, as you can see, it takes over pretty much the entire brain. There were a lot of people from a few years who said, this thing doesn't exist. It's just part of some of these other diseases. There's nothing special about it. Until Dr. McKee brought together a group of the most famous neuropathologists around, including some naysayers, and these are people from outside of the US as well as inside. And they all looked at a bunch of slides of people with CT, people with Alzheimer's, different types of things. And what they all agreed upon was, yes, indeed, folks, CTE is a disease. It's a unique disease. It's unique from other diseases that have this abnormal tau. And it's only seen in people with a history of previous brain trauma, and usually that is repetitive. I want to go now back in time and show you just a few cases of people whose brains were examined by Dr. McKee, and I had the great privilege of learning about the individual. So while Dr. McKee and her team were looking at the brain tissue, I then interviewed the family members of all these deceased individuals and looked through medical records and found out what I possibly could about the individual's life and course and medical history, etc. So the first case that was ever examined by our team was that of John Grimsley. John died tragically at the age of 45. He was a professional football player. Most of his career he was with the Oilers, and prior to his death he was talking to his wife, and she remembered him saying, I probably had 8 concussions during my career. Now that's a lot for a football player to actually remember and admit to. Probably had many, many more. As a linebacker, he was probably getting his head hit all the time. But imagine all the subconcussive trauma he also had. After he retired from the NFL, he was a successful hunting and fishing guide. And I tell you that to let you know that he knew his way around firearms. Unfortunately, for the 5 years prior to his death, he started having an increasingly awful memory. And he also had this short fuse. He would blow up over everything. Not like him. That was not what he used to be like. He was a sweet guy. Sadly, one night, he was home alone, and he was doing what he did all the time, which was cleaning his guns. And he accidentally shot himself in the chest while cleaning his guns because it seems like he forgot to take out the ammunition. I believe it was Chris Nowinski who got on the phone and called his widow within a day of the death and asked if she would mind donating his brain. And she did. She's a remarkable woman and really started this whole thing going. So when Anne looked at the brain, on the top you can see a slice of the brain that is not microscopically enhanced, and on the bottom is a microscopic enhancement of one of these areas up here. And what you can see is a huge amount of the brain tissue being devastated at age 45 with this abnormal tau. And underneath here, you can see the neurofibrillary tangles and then a whole bunch of other abnormal tau stuff. Let's put it in perspective. He's 45 years old. Should we see that even in a healthy older person? Well, that's the healthy older person, the typical 65-year-old. And you don't see any of this stuff. It shouldn't be there. Greater perspective, here's the brain of a 73-year-old world-class boxer who was institutionalized for several years because of dementia. Diagnosed clinically as having dementia pugilistica, and lo and behold, yes, they were right. He did have CTE. Look at that, though. Yes, it's a greater severity. But the 45-year-old football player and the 73-year-old boxer, that was pretty striking. The second case of a professional football player that came to us was that of Tom McHale. Chris also called Tom's widow, Lisa McHale, who's then become a very dear friend to all of us and a member of Chris's organization and really has played a huge role in this whole thing. When he died, both she and we thought that his brain was going to be a control. Why? Because Tom McHale, although he was a 9-year NFL veteran lineman for the Buccaneers, he had no reported concussions. And in those days, right at the beginning of what we were doing, we thought it was all about concussion. We didn't think about this subconcussive stuff. We just thought it was about the big hits over and over again. So here's a guy whose teammates, team doctors, his own wife who knew him since college in the Cornell days, no one ever heard him complain about any symptoms that would have been considered a concussion. He never had any of those big hits, never had any loss of consciousness, but never anything that sounded like a concussion. And so when Lisa agreed to donate the brain, it was because we all thought it was going to be a control. But remember, as a lineman, thousands and thousands and thousands of those hits. After he graduated from Cornell, he went to the NFL. He was at the NFL for 9 years, then he retired, and he was a very successful restaurateur in the Tampa Bay area. He had 3 wonderful boys, this wonderful relationship with Lisa, and then came a problem. He started getting addicted to painkillers that he started to take because of the typical things that former players get, which is lots of orthopedic pains and surgeries, and he couldn't get off of them. And he was described as being out of control, could not get off of them, would go to rehab, come out, stop, and then start again. And then sadly, one night he died of an overdose after that multi-year battle. It wasn't a control. That was one of the scary moments for our team, was to see a guy who didn't have any concussions, and he had this disease. Later on, Dave Duerson, a case that some of you probably heard about, he was a very famous Chicago Bear player. He played on the last time the Bears won the Super Bowl. I think that was 1870. I won't go into Duerson's entire history. It's a really interesting one if you can read about it. But after he retired, he was a successful businessman in the food distribution business. He made millions and millions of dollars. And then sadly, 5 years or so prior to his death at age 50, he started having also short-term memory difficulties. He started being out of control. Again, that short fuse, being hot-tempered for a guy who was like this teddy bear. He also then sadly became physically abusive and abused his wife. He became verbally abusive. He lost his business. He lost his millions. He lost his marriage. Then one night, he shot himself in the chest in order to avoid hitting his brain and left a suicide note and text messages that his brain be donated to our center. And lo and behold, he knew. All right, it's not just football. We've seen CTE, yes, in over 150 individuals. I think at this point it's well over that, including mostly football players because those are the brains that have been donated to us. But we've also seen it, as one would expect, in boxers. We've also seen it in hockey players, but only the enforcers. The enforcers, for those of you who don't know hockey, they're the boxers on ice. We've seen it in other athletes. Here is a well-known Australian rugby player, Tizza Taylor. In his 50s, after he stopped playing, he started having significant cognitive difficulties, and then he had severe dementia just in his 60s, and he died. And here's his brain. For those of you who are used to seeing any brain tissue like this, you'll see in this picture that there ain't that much brain tissue left. And there isn't a hint of Alzheimer's disease or any other disease except for CTE in a guy who hit his head playing rugby over and over again. It's not just the pros. And I think if it were only pros, we wouldn't be here talking about it. And for me, it wouldn't be as big a public health issue. We've seen it in former college football players. We've seen it now in former college soccer player. This is one of those football players. A sad case of a guy named Owen Thomas, who was in his junior year. He had just been voted unanimously the co-captain of the University of Pennsylvania football team. He had been playing as a lineman since the age of 9. And again, no concussions. This is his brother right here who played on many teams with him. He had no history, knowledge of concussions. These are his two wonderful parents who had a great relationship with him, never any complaints or symptoms of concussion through the years. His pediatricians, his team docs, his athletic director, no one, his teammates, he never had what would be have considered, at least then, concussion. Sadly, he hanged himself in his off-campus apartment at the end of his junior year. No note, very impulsively. His brain was examined, and he's showing at age 21 the beginnings of CTE, those telltale diagnostic features of this disease, just at the age of 21. So the question that everyone always then asks is, was suicide caused by CTE? Hey, it's unlikely. You know, suicide is so tragically common, especially in that age group. It's very complex. It's a very multifactorial problem with many causes. But the most important thing that Owen Thomas's case showed us was that, number one, you can start seeing this disease in the brain at just age 21, and yet, again, it was a case of CTE without a history of concussions. All right, so now the neuropathology of CTE has been remarkably well described by Dr. McKee. She's been a game changer, so to speak. Those pictures paint 1,000 words, and they've had this tremendous impact on society, on public policy, on awareness. However, I think the public and even science thinks that the science of CTE is far more advanced than it actually is. You know, since everything started back in around 2005, then we started in around 2008, this attention to this disease has been phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. The problem is that science, even the best of funding circumstances, moves like this. And these, for those of you in science, know that these last several years have not been the best of circumstances. But let me give you an idea. Some of the craziness of the media hype about this problem. This was an episode of Harry's Law. They stole the name of Chris's book and my talk, Head Games. And it was a case of CTE, a deceased case of CTE. They needed a BU researcher to come to the stand to talk about CTE. Look familiar? My wife says I'm better looking. 1 week later, to I think the day, Law and Order SVU needed to do a case. On the top is the real Anne McKee. They needed an unnamed BU researcher to come to the stand because this football player, a pro football player, was dementing and he was acting inappropriately. Did you see that picture? Soon after, every TV show was doing CTE, The Good Wife. At least they called me. They called me for script advice. And I said, sure, as long as I get to meet what's her name? Margolyes. Juliana Margolyes. They said no. House, who is the best diagnostician on the planet, he ruled out CTE. That's how good he is. CSI, it goes on and on and on, and yet we're still really in the infancy of our knowledge. However, I got to tell you, it's kind of cool. Just 3 days ago, I was interviewed for 60 Minutes. So you're the first to see a picture about it. So I think it's really cool. So forget the hype. What do we know? What is it that we actually do know right now? Well, we don't know much. What do we need to know? A ton. For starters, we need to figure out if it's common or not. And we just do not know. Some of you probably have been reading that at our center in Dr. McKee's brain bank, 87 of 91 professional football players who've been examined have had CTE neuropathologically. That sounds really amazing, and in fact it is. But that's biased. The brains who get examined are coming to us for a reason. So that's not how you do epidemiological research. So we need to do longitudinal research with large sample sizes in order to figure out what's the incidence and prevalence of this disease. We also have to figure out why is it that some people get it and some people don't. So there is one very important thing that we do know at this point, that all neuropathologically confirmed cases of CTE have had a history of repetitive hits to the head, this repetitive brain trauma. So translate that. Well, to me, that means that repetitive brain trauma is a necessary but not sufficient cause of this disease. In other words, not everyone who hits their head a lot is going to get it. So then we have to figure out, what are the risk factors? Are there things like genetics that put some people at greater risk than others? Are there specific genes and genetic polymorphisms? Well, we showed in a paper of ours a couple years ago that the ApoE E4 genotype seems to be more elevated in people with CTE than people without it. But we don't know. We're doing more studies now. It seems to be showing similar stuff, but we're looking at other genes as well. But what about the exposure itself? It's not just getting your head hit over and over again that does it. So we have to figure out, what about things like the severity of the hits, the types of the hits, the overall duration of getting hit, the rest in between hits, the total amount. And then one thing we've been looking at is the age at first exposure to these hits. So why are we looking at that? This was work done by a PhD student of mine who graduated from BU last year with her PhD, Julie Stam. And she looked at this question of, is there a window of neurodevelopmental vulnerability? And why was she looking at this time in chronology? Well, because there's a whole lot of research through the years that suggests that between the ages of around 9 and 12, the brain is going through this incredible growth in all ways. And if that period, that pre-adolescent period, is this time of crazy growth, that if you do something to it during that time, maybe it's going to have later life problems. So this paper that was published in the Journal of Neurology was looking at 42 currently living former NFL players, all between the ages of 40 and 69. So they're middle-aged now. And what she did was she matched them up. So she created 21 pairs. And each pair was the same age now. So it's a pair of two people like at age 60, pair two people age 50, etc. One person in the pair started playing tackle football before age 12, and one person in the pair started playing at age 12 or older. Got it? It's a neat little paradigm. And then we looked at what their cognitive functioning was now. Gave them a whole bunch of different tests. And indeed, the ones who started playing before age 12 had significantly worse memory and executive functioning now in life compared to the ones who started at age 12 or older. And obviously, we statistically controlled for the number of years played, et cetera. So the question then is there something going on in the brain that we can detect? Some structural alteration in how the brain developed? And so that led to a second paper that just came out recently where we looked at that age of first exposure and looked at the big part of the brain that connects one side to the other, the corpus callosum, this white matter tract. And we did some really cool things with our colleagues over at Brigham and Women's Hospital under the direction of Dr. Martha Shenton, with a technique of MRI called diffusion tensor imaging. And what Julie did was she split up the corpus callosum into 5 meaningful kind of fiber tract groups. And again, same pairs. And what happened was the ones who started playing before age 12 had significantly altered corpus callosum in the front part, the anterior part of the corpus callosum, compared to the ones who started playing at age 12 or older. All right, so that's a neat thing. It's a start to maybe answer some questions about, is there that period of vulnerability? But that set of studies are very limited. We were only looking at professional football players. What about people who only played through college or high school? Are there different eras of the times of play? People who played 50 years ago, do they have a different type of exposure to hits than people who are playing now in Pop Warner? And we weren't looking at CTE necessarily in that case. We were just looking at how are these people now functioning and what does their brain look like. But despite those limitations, I want you to look at this and ask yourself the question, should we be not just allowing this, but condoning this?
Go, go!
Oh, get up. Gosh.
Those are like 8-year-olds.
Go, go!
Oh, get up. Gosh.
All right, move on. In order to answer these types of questions better, the next important step is to diagnose CTE during life. To me, that's it. That's the critical thing. Because it will allow us to do a whole bunch of important things, like to differentiate between people who have CTE and people who have Alzheimer's disease or the other diseases like frontotemporal lobar degeneration or post-traumatic stress disorder, or just the persistent and chronic sequelae of having a concussion and post-concussion syndrome or a traumatic brain injury. We'd also be able to actually then look at epidemiology, actually count people while they're alive. And then we'll actually be able to look at those risk factors even better, looking at the genetics and the exposure types of variables. And then eventually, we'd be able to do clinical trials to try to treat it and prevent it. So the first step in this process to me would be to, let's describe what it looks like clinically. Someone has it. What do we think they look like? Well, through all the case reports of those boxers and now football players, it seems like there's these 3 or 4 primary domains of clinical features. Cognitive problems, which later in life develop into a full-blown dementia. Dementia just basically meaning there's memory and cognitive difficulties bad enough to get in the way of daily life. There's mood problems. There's these very important behavior changes. And then in some people, there's this motor difficulty. Imagine Muhammad Ali. And so what we did was we looked at a bunch of people who were neuropathologically diagnosed with CTE, and they had nothing else going on in their brain. And based on those interviews that we did with all the family members and the review of the medical records, we looked at those types of symptoms and tried to figure out when did they start, who had them, and we tried to answer a question that based on the previous literature, are there two different subtypes of this thing? And so what we found was that consistent with those case reports in the past, there were two subtypes of how these symptoms first start. So the initial presentation of this disease seems to have these two different groups, the ones who start with behavior or mood changes, and then another group who start by having cognitive difficulties. And the people who start with the behavior and mood problems were significantly younger than the ones who start with the cognitive difficulties. And in this group, primarily of football players, there were very few people who had motor problems. So the second step would be to use all that kind of preliminary stuff and come up with some provisional diagnostic criteria. Not the real stuff, not the real criteria, but let's start the ball going. And so we published this paper a year and a half ago, I guess, that presented these provisional criteria with the clinical presentation with something that we refer to as traumatic encephalopathy syndrome. Because we don't know if it's CTE. We don't know what might be causing it. We just want to define and diagnose the clinical presentation, so we have all these different types of variants of it. But then we also want to be able to take that when we're able to in the future and come up with a clinical diagnosis of CTE. And so we borrow from other diseases like Alzheimer's the terms probable and possible CTE. So to have probable CTE, you have to have this traumatic encephalopathy syndrome. It has to be progressive. And very importantly, you need those biomarkers. So what's a biomarker? It's a way that if you combine it with a clinical type of presentation, it will improve our accuracy of diagnosing a disease. Step 3, develop the best damn acronym anyone's ever developed. I know I'm getting the Nobel Prize for acronym development. DETECT. Look at that. Look at that. Just, you saw it here. What that lovely acronym is for a study that is just about ending. It was an NIH-funded study. It's kind of good news, bad news. It was great that we got this thing. The sad part was that this was the first NIH grant ever funded for CTE, even though we've known about it since 1928. So we got the funding, did a study. What we've done is we've looked at 100 former NFL players, all between those ages of 40 and 69, all who played positions with the highest exposure to repetitive hits. And before they came to Boston, they at least responded to a bunch of questions that said that they had some symptoms. And then we wanted to get rid of the one important thing that puts people we know at risk for CTE, and that's repetitive hits to the head. And so we have a control group of around 30 same-age individuals, mostly athletes, but who never played contact sports, who never hit their head, who never had a traumatic brain injury of any type. And we have done everything to them. They've come to Boston for 2 or 3 days over the last few years, and they've gotten all this incredible advanced neuroimaging by my colleagues at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. We do lumbar punctures, and we have the best colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania who are the gurus of looking at these proteins in cerebrospinal fluid. We've been doing EEGs with this company called BrainScope, who's developed this neat way of being able to do EEG analysis quickly. We've done a whole bunch of genetic analyses. We've given them every single clinical examination you could ever imagine. But when we started this, we were designing all of these things because we had no way of actually measuring tau, other than in the cerebrospinal fluid. So we were thinking we were going to have kind of proxies of this disease, but at least we were going to start. So what I want to do is let you know that the study's actually ending next week. The last subject over the 3 or 4 year period is being done next week. But I want to show you some preliminary findings of this. Some are published, some are not yet published. Let's go back to the neuropathology. This is a slice of a brain as if you cut it like this. And what we find is that almost all individuals with CTE have this thing called a cavum septum pellucidum. It's right here. That little thing that looks like a cave right in the middle of these two ventricles, it looks like another ventricle, that should just be this nice little sheath separating the two ventricles. But in almost all of these CT cases, Dr. McKee has shown that there's this cavum. It opens up. It's split up for some reason. So if we know that in people who've died, then wouldn't we be able to use an MRI to try to detect the same thing? And so my colleagues, Dr. Inga Kurta over at Harvard and Dr. Shenton and her group looked at our DETECT subjects, and we just published this paper just very recently, and that showed that indeed these former NFL players are significantly showing this cavum septum pellucidum while they're alive, and that there was a relationship between the length, the extent of this thing, and their cognitive functioning. Another cool thing, this one's not published yet, this is using something called magnetic resonance spectroscopy. It's data you get from an MRI scan, but it's a virtual biopsy, in that it's allowing you to look at the actual biochemical metabolites inside the brain while someone's living. And so my colleague, Dr. Alex Lin, is the leader of this stuff. And without going into all the details, I'll just tell you, it's really cool that we're actually seeing the ability to detect biochemical changes in the brain. And they happen to be the types of changes that we would expect to see in a disease like this. But the next important step would be to do things like actually see tau in the brain. And like I said, when we started this, it wasn't going to happen. We were talking years and years and years ahead before the first human study would ever be able to be done with a PET scan being able to look at tau in the living brain. But over the past 3 years, there have been 4 more groups around the world that have been developing these special ligands, these radioactive tracers that attach to this abnormal tau protein. You get it into the bloodstream, it goes into the brain, and it's temporarily radioactive. It attaches to the abnormal tau. You put the person in the PET scanner, and then you see where it attached to. They're in their early phases of development now, but since we started, there's now hundreds and hundreds of scans that have been done with a variety of these types of compounds. The one we've been working with is really, I think, the best. It's called T807. And right now it's run by this company called Avid Radiopharmaceuticals. And so what we did was we added that PET scan and another PET scan that looks at another protein called amyloid. So we have these 2 extra PET scans. Now we're doing with all those DETECT subjects. And so I'm just going to show you a little glimpse into the future. We hope this is going to pan out in the future, because right now it's really exciting. These are just images of people's brains, okay, with a MRI superimposed on it. But all the places that you see, the little hot spots, those little bright things, that's where the tau is. And none of these cases that we looked at had the abnormal amyloid protein that you might see in Alzheimer's disease. So here's another view of it. That's the tau, that's the tau, that's the tau, that's the tau. I want you to remember one thing. That's a neuropathological picture, brain tissue, stained for tau. Where is the tau? In the depths of the cortical sulci. Where are we seeing it on a PET scan? Stay tuned. Cerebrospinal fluid. When we compare the NFL group to the controls, indeed, cerebrospinal fluid, we do see this increased amount of this abnormal tau compared to the total tau in the spinal fluid. And then came the question, would we ever be able to have a blood test? That's what I want to end with today. I used to have this picture in my slide deck when I would talk about Alzheimer's disease, when I would say, there ain't no way we're ever going to have a blood test for Alzheimer's or any one of these diseases. It just can't be done. I was wrong. We're now making incredible headway in the ability to detect some important changes in the blood of people with these various neurodegenerative diseases. Well, one way that we're looking at it is through a special kind of new technology that's able to detect minute amounts of protein. And this tau is really, really in low abundance in the blood. And so you'd need a special technology to even detect it at all. And this new technology from the Quanterix company was able to detect it in our former football players. And there's this significant relationship between the plasma tau, the blood tau, and the spinal fluid tau. So we're going to look at that a little bit more. And then comes this thing that I'm going to end with, looking at what we refer to as plasma exosomal tau, which means measuring tau from the brain cells through a blood test. That's a weird concept. Let me explain it. These things called exosomes have been looked at for many decades now, primarily in cancer work. And what they are, they're these little tiny vesicles that all cells let go. And they come out of the cell and they carry the cargo of the cell. They're like a little microcosm of the cell itself, including proteins. Bless you. She's going to be so embarrassed now. The thing about these exosomes is that they're incredibly stable. And so they make for this liquid biopsy being possible. They're used as cancer markers, tumor markers already. But here's one cool thing, is that exosomes cross this thing called the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier is this wonderful thing that keeps our brains safe. But it also keeps it so very little of import gets away. So that's why we can't measure things usually in the blood. But these exosomes get across. All right, I want to show you my cool little graphics. In here is supposed to be inside of a neuron. Here's outside of a neuron, but still within the brain. And here's the development of exosomes. Here's a protein, tau, and it's going to get pulled into these little teeny vesicles inside the nerve cell. And so these things are each exosomes, and they each have a little bit of tau in them as well as other proteins. And then the cell, watch this, this is very cool technology. You want to see it again? I'm proud. So the cell releases that exosome, and then something even better happens. My technology increases. Remind you, here's the exosome inside the brain on this side of the blood-brain barrier, and it crosses the blood-brain barrier into the blood. And so then, if you can actually isolate those brain-derived exosomes in the plasma, watch this. That's the end. And you measure them because you then put antibodies on for the special tau. Then maybe what you're actually measuring is the amount of abnormal tau from inside the brain cells, but through a blood test. So we have a paper that's currently under review that looks at this specifically in that DETECT study, where we compare the groups and what we get those exosomes out of the plasma, and we attach the antibodies for tau, and really cool things then were found. The differences between the groups are stunning. And in fact, if we look at sensitivity and specificity and analyses, it's remarkable how well this simple type of blood test can differentiate between the groups. But more interestingly, within the NFL group alone, the higher the exosomal tau, the worse the memory and the speed of psychomotor processing. That's wild. So, it's only the beginning. The way we did it was lousy. We have to refine it. And then we have to validate it with post-mortem samples of definite CTE. But we're on the way. We're on the way to future research, to be able to look at all those things I've been talking about, to be able to look at the risk factors, the genetics, different things about the exposure, and then try to be able to diagnose the disease while people are alive using all the methods I was just describing and more. And so we put in this very important big 7-year grant to the National Institutes of Health with colleagues of mine who are kind of just these unbelievable leaders around the country. I was very fortunate to work with them and 50 other collaborators putting this thing together. And I probably shouldn't show you this next thing, but we're getting it. So that's going to allow all these answers, hopefully, to come to fruition in not too long a period. And then once we can diagnose CTE, we can then do things like clinical trials. Because there are compounds being developed to reduce the amount of tau or to stop the abnormal tau from developing, other parts of the disease that could be attacked with new drugs. And if we can detect the disease even before there are symptoms, and we intervene with these new disease-modifying agents, then what we might actually be able to do is kind of prevent it from ever rearing its ugly head. And if that doesn't work, then we might have to rely on something like this, which is just maybe common sense. Just want to show you where our research funding comes from for my clinical research, all these different places. And then most importantly, there are more people doing this work, making it easy for me to just get up and make jokes. They do the actual work. They're the brains behind it all. I'm sure I'm missing some people from this. And so importantly, I got one of these guys right here, Chris Nowinski. And of course, my colleague, Dr. Ann McKee, who's just put all this on the map, and Dr. Robert Cantu, who's been just a tremendous guide and mentor throughout all this. So with all that, I just want to thank you. Questions? So, a couple things. Remember, there's a reception. And we can take maybe 2 questions. So people have questions. People who need to leave, please leave. But if you do have questions, raise your hand. I'll point and I'll repeat it. Wow. Oh, there is a question. Okay.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm a Sargent College alum, master's degree in physical therapy in 1984. My first job was working with head-injured adults, seriously, like long-term coma situations. I didn't consider my own concussions that significant until later on. I've had 10 concussions. 9 of the 10 resulted in loss of consciousness, starting from age 2 up till age 60. So, and I won't go into the details, but I'm concerned. I came partly because I got the mailing from BU, but also because none of the people, I tell people my history, the professionals that I've seen, and I got a, oh my gosh, sort of response, which doesn't help me. No. And I've had no, one skull X-ray done in the 70s, but really no imaging. So and I've had neuropsych testing at Mass General, very Molly Colvin, and very thoroughly done, but I don't know really where to go with that, and I don't know whether you would suggest imaging, other kind of tests, who I should see, because I know I'm at some risk, and that's my question.
First of all, thank you. First of all, for being here, and for sharing the way you just did. You raise such a critically important question, and that is, I was poo-pooing concussions. I was saying that it's all about the overall amount of hits. So at what point do we think that these big concussions with loss of consciousness and symptoms can increase the risk of later life problems? And the real answer is we have no idea. And I can't say for sure to you or to anyone that having a lot of concussions doesn't increase your risk for later life problems, whether it is CTE or some research suggested that I'm not really sure about, maybe Alzheimer's disease. The reality is that if you live old enough, 1 out of 2 people age 85 and older has Alzheimer's disease. We don't know what the real risk is for CTE, whether you've had 3 concussions, 50 concussions, or 20 years of repetitive subconcussive trauma. We just don't know. And so then the question that he asks is, what do you do? And this is meant for anyone. And that is not panic, because we don't know. And the reality right now is that we'd want to treat symptoms anyways, because we don't know what's causing the symptoms. And we don't have tried and true treatments yet for the underlying disease, whatever it might be, if there is one. And so if there are symptoms, then treating them aggressively by someone who knows just how to treat these individual symptoms along the way. But in terms of being able to understand risk, should you be scared or not, I wish I had the answer, but there is no real answer. One more question. Yes?
Hi, Dr. Stern. I really enjoyed the talk. It's fascinating research. I'm most excited in the exome data that you have so far with the blood test. How do you know that the tau you're isolating from the blood comes from the CNS and not from the peripheral nervous system?
It's a great question. It wasn't on the mic. So the question is, for the exosome research, how do we know that the exosomes are actually coming from the brain versus peripheral nervous system or even muscle, things like that? There are new ways to tag the exosomes that weren't really available when we were doing this. Now we're going to as the next step, that allow us to tag the cell surface in ways that make it pretty confident that it comes from the brain, and in ways also come from neuron versus glia. That's one way that needs to be done. But the other way that, for me, made it more confident is that there was a direct relationship, a very strong relationship, between the level of this tau and cognition, which wouldn't happen if it weren't from the brain. The other thing is that the amount of tau outside of the brain is so minute relative to the amount of tau that comes from brain cells themselves. It probably would have gotten overrun by other factors. But it's a great question, and it's the one that is now leading our research forward to the next step. Okay, thank you very much.